The pen trembled in the German intelligence officer's hand. Outside his window in Berlin, winter 1944 pressed against the glass like a held breath. Inside, spread across his mahogany desk, lay reconnaissance photographs that should have terrified every military strategist in the Reich. Hundreds of Sherman tanks, dozens of landing craft, an entire American army group massing in southeast England under the command of George Patton, the general Hitler feared most. The officer's throat tightened as he studied the images. Tank treads carved deep into English mud, supply depots stretched for miles. Radio intercepts crackled with coded transmissions between divisions, preparing for invasion. Every piece of intelligence pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. Pas de Calais, the shortest route across the Channel, the logical strike point, the place where Germany had concentrated its most formidable defenses. He picked up his telephone with steady fingers, calling his superior. His voice carried absolute certainty when he delivered the report. The intelligence was irrefutable. Patton's 1st United States Army Group would spearhead the invasion at Calais within weeks. What the officer didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that every tank in those photographs was made of rubber and canvas. Every landing craft was wood and empty oil drums. Every radio transmission was scripted theater. And George Patton? He was commanding an army that didn't exist. June 6, 1944, would become the most audacious, amphibious invasion in human history. But in December 1943, when Allied planners gathered in London's underground war rooms, the mathematics of Operation Overlord looked impossible. 156,000 men would need to cross the English Channel. They would storm 5 beaches against German defenses that had been fortified for 4 years. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had spent months transforming the French coastline into what Hitler called Fortress Europe. Millions of mines buried in sand, steel obstacles welded into underwater forests, concrete bunkers housing machine guns that could sweep beaches clear of human life in minutes. The German 7th Army defended Normandy with 150,000 soldiers. The 15th Army guarded Pas de Calais with another 150,000. If the Wehrmacht knew where the invasion would land, they could concentrate both armies at a single point. 300,000 defenders against 156,000 invaders. The Allies would be massacred on the beaches, their bodies washing back and forth with the tide. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark understood this brutal arithmetic. He sat in a Cairo office in 1942, studying maps of North Africa, when he conceived an idea that would reshape warfare itself. What if you could make an enemy see armies that didn't exist? What if you could convince them to defend the wrong places, to waste resources chasing phantoms, to commit their reserves against threats that were nothing more than smoke and mirrors? Clark had pioneered deception tactics during the North African campaign. He created fake harbors to draw Luftwaffe bombers away from real ports. He built dummy supply depots that German reconnaissance photographed and reported as legitimate targets. Most brilliantly, he learned that the human mind sees what it expects to see. German intelligence already believed certain things about Allied strategy. Clark simply reinforced those beliefs with carefully crafted lies. By late 1943, Clark's techniques had proven devastatingly effective. Now the Allies needed to scale them up for the largest military operation ever attempted. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Operation Overlord failed, the war in Europe might drag on for years. Millions more would die. The Soviet Union might negotiate a separate peace with Germany. The atomic bombs being developed in American laboratories might be deployed against European cities instead of Japanese ones. The deception would need to be perfect, comprehensive, sustained over months. It would need to fool not just frontline commanders, but Hitler himself, a dictator who trusted his intuition more than his general's advice. In December 1943, The London controlling section began developing what would become Operation Bodyguard. The name came from Winston Churchill himself, who had famously said, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Under the bodyguard umbrella, planners developed Operation Fortitude, the specific deception targeting the Normandy invasion. Fortitude would be split into two components. Fortitude North would threaten Norway, convincing Hitler to keep divisions stationed in Scandinavia. Fortitude South would create an entirely fictional invasion force aimed at Pas de Calais. The man tasked with perfecting this deception was Colonel David Strangeways, head of Montgomery's Air Force deception staff. When Strangeways first read the proposed Fortitude plan in February 1944, he was unimpressed. The original concept was too complicated, too theoretical. The planners had never executed deception operations themselves. They didn't understand how German intelligence actually worked. Strangeways rewrote the entire operation. His version was elegant in its simplicity. Create one massive phantom army that German reconnaissance could photograph, German radio operators could track, and German spies could report on. Make it so convincing that even when the real invasion began at Normandy, Hitler would still believe it was merely a diversion. The Phantom Army would be called the First United States Army Group, FUSAG, and it would be commanded by the one American general the Germans feared above all others. George Smith, Patton Jr., stood 6 feet tall and carried himself like a man who had been born to command armies. His voice could strip paint off walls. His profanity was legendary. His pearl-handled revolvers were always holstered at his hips, even in headquarters far from combat. The Germans called him Der Bluthund, the Bloodhound, for his relentless pursuit of enemy forces across North Africa and Sicily. After American intelligence decrypted German military communications, analysts discovered something remarkable. Wehrmacht commanders mentioned Patton more than any other Allied general. They studied his tactics. They feared his armor. They knew that wherever Patton appeared, devastating offensive operations would follow. This made Patton the perfect choice to command FUSAG. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, operated on logical assumptions. The Allies would surely assign their most aggressive, successful general to lead the most important operation. If Patton was in southeast England, then the main invasion must be coming from there. But Patton almost destroyed everything before the deception even began. In April 1944, Patton attended the opening of a welcome club in Knutsford, England. A reporter asked him to say a few words. Patton, never one to avoid a microphone, declared that after the war, Britain and America would rule the world. The comment exploded into an international scandal. The Soviet Union took offense. American politicians demanded his dismissal. Eisenhower seriously considered sending Patton home in disgrace. The scandal, ironically, only strengthened the deception. German intelligence intercepted all the outraged communications about Patton's future. When Eisenhower ultimately kept Patton in England, the Germans concluded he must be too valuable to lose. This reinforced their belief that Patton would lead the invasion. Throughout the spring of 1944, Patton played his role perfectly. He visited FUSAG installations in Kent and Essex installations that existed only as props. He posed for photographs in front of inflatable tanks. He met with Phantom Division commanders, whose units consisted of radio operators broadcasting scripted conversations. He gave speeches to assembled troops who were actually stage crews maintaining the elaborate set. German reconnaissance planes photographed him touring these facilities. Their pilots flew back to occupied France and reported, "Patton is in southeast England. He's inspecting an enormous army." The invasion will come at Calais. What made this deception so powerful was that Patton himself was real. His reputation was real. His past victories were real. The Germans built their analysis on the one piece of intelligence they could verify: Patton's location. From that single truth, they constructed an entirely false conclusion. Juan Pujol García should have been nobody. Born in Barcelona in 1912, he failed at nearly everything he attempted. He dropped out of school. He started businesses that collapsed. He served briefly in the Spanish army and hated military discipline. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, Pujol hid rather than fight. He managed a poultry farm near the French border, then quit that too. By 1941, Pujol was a 30-year-old chicken farmer, with no prospects, no skills, and no apparent future. But he had something more valuable than training or experience. He possessed an absolute moral clarity about fascism. He had watched Franco's dictatorship brutalize Spain. He had seen Hitler's Wehrmacht conquer Europe. He believed these regimes represented evil, and he wanted to fight them. Pujol approached the British embassy in Madrid 3 times, volunteering to become a spy. The British rejected him all 3 times. He had no connections, no intelligence experience, no access to sensitive information. He was, in their assessment, useless. So Pujol decided to become a German spy first, then offer himself to the British as a double agent. He created a fake identity as a fanatical Spanish fascist official who could travel to London on government business. He convinced a printer to forge Spanish diplomatic credentials by pretending to work for the embassy. He contacted German intelligence and told them he had access to Britain and wanted to spy for the Reich. The Germans, desperate for intelligence from England, accepted immediately. They gave him invisible ink, questionnaires about British defenses, and a code name, Arabelle. There was only one problem. Pujol never actually went to England. He had no money for the trip. He couldn't speak English. He had never left the Iberian Peninsula. From Lisbon, Portugal, Pujol began inventing an entire espionage career. He bought a blue guide to England, a tourist reference book, and studied it like scripture. He purchased a map of the British Isles. He read British newspapers and magazines available in Portuguese libraries. Using these sources, he started sending intelligence reports to his German handlers. The reports were masterpieces of creative fiction. Pujol described British convoys leaving Liverpool. Though he claimed they departed Glasgow, he didn't realize these were different cities. He reported that Glaswegians would do anything for a liter of wine, not knowing that Scots preferred whiskey. He described British soldiers paying for women in brothels with highly unrealistic amounts of money. But Pujol's reports contained just enough verifiable truth to seem credible. He plagiarized news from BBC broadcasts. He copied shipping schedules from newspapers. He invented plausible-sounding details about military morale and civilian attitudes. The Germans, starved for intelligence from Britain, overlooked the errors and focused on the kernels of accurate information. In November 1941, Pujol sent a warning that a British convoy had left port painted in Mediterranean camouflage. He predicted an invasion of North Africa. The report reached German intelligence in Madrid. By the time it was forwarded to Berlin and analyzed, Operation Torch had already begun. British and American forces landing in Morocco and Algeria. The Germans were furious that the report arrived too late, but they were also impressed. Their agent, Arabelle, had been right about the operation. If only his information had reached them faster, they might have reinforced North African defenses. Pujol had become a trusted source. British intelligence finally noticed him in early 1942, when they began decrypting German communications and kept seeing references to an agent in England, except they knew no such agent existed. MI5 tracked the source back to Pujol in Lisbon. Desmond Bristow, of MI6, interviewed Pujol and realized he was dealing with either a lunatic or a genius. After debriefing him extensively, Bristow concluded, "Genius." The British brought Pujol and his family to England in April 1942. They gave him the codename Garbo, after Greta Garbo, because he was the best actor in the world. Pujol was paired with Tomás Harris, an MI5 officer who spoke fluent Spanish. Together, they began constructing what would become the most successful deception operation in espionage history. Pujol invented a network of 27 sub-agents. Each agent had a detailed biography, personality, and area of expertise. There was Agent 3, a Venezuelan businessman based in Glasgow. Agent 4, a Gibraltarian waiter working at military canteens. Agent 7, a Welsh ex-seaman who hated the English. None of these people existed. But Pujol and Harris wrote them into life with such detail that the Germans never questioned their reality. The German handlers paid Pujol to fund this network. They sent money to support his fictitious agents. They awarded Pujol decorations for his intelligence work. By 1944, the Germans considered him their most valuable spy in Britain. This gave Pujol enormous credibility when Operation Fortitude began. When he reported on Fusag's formation, the Germans believed him completely. When he described Patton's arrival in southeast England, they accepted it as fact. When he sent detailed reports about divisions, equipment, and invasion preparations at Calais, German intelligence incorporated his information into their strategic assessments. Pujol even killed off one of his fictitious agents to maintain the deception's credibility. He reported that Agent 4 had died from illness and planted an obituary in a British newspaper. The Germans sent condolences to the imaginary widow and paid for funeral expenses. In the fields and harbors of southeast England, a different kind of magic was unfolding. Engineers from the 603rd Camouflage Battalion arrived in Kent and Essex with trucks full of equipment that looked nothing like traditional military hardware. Instead of guns and ammunition, they carried air compressors, steel drums, canvas sheeting, and wooden frames. These men were artists, set designers, and engineers before the war. Now they were tasked with building an army large enough to invade France. The inflatable tanks came first. Each one was constructed from rubberized canvas, stitched into the precise shape of an M4 Sherman tank. Deflated, it could be rolled up and carried by 2 men. Connected to an air compressor, it inflated in 30 minutes. From the ground, especially at night, the tanks looked ridiculous fabric shapes, held upright by air pressure. But from 1,500 feet, the altitude German reconnaissance planes flew at, they were indistinguishable from real armor. The engineers positioned hundreds of these dummy tanks in staging areas across southeast England. They parked them in formations that matched how real armored divisions would deploy before an invasion. They created tire tracks in the mud behind each tank using rolling equipment. They positioned camouflage netting over some tanks, deliberately imperfect camouflage that German aerial photography could detect. The landing craft were even more ingenious. In harbors and estuaries around Dover and Folkestone, engineers built 255 dummy invasion craft. Each one was constructed from scaffolding tubes, lashed to buoyant steel drums, and covered with canvas, painted to look like metal. From the air, they created the impression of a massive naval force preparing to cross the channel. The dummy craft had one significant flaw: they were too light. Wind and rain flipped many of them over or drove them onto mudflats. Engineers had to constantly reposition them, adding more weight, repainting them after storms. It was exhausting work maintaining this fleet of fiction. Dummy supply depots appeared across the countryside. Wooden crates stacked to look like ammunition supplies. Canvas tents arranged in neat military rows. Fake gasoline storage tanks painted in regulation colors. From above, German pilots photographed what appeared to be the logistical infrastructure needed to support an invasion force of hundreds of thousands. The physical deception was supported by an even more sophisticated radio operation. British and Canadian signals units set up transmitters throughout southeast England. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they broadcast fake radio traffic simulating the communications of FUSAG divisions. The radio operators worked in 8-hour shifts in underground facilities, including the tunnels beneath Dover Castle. They sent encoded messages between fictitious units using real military protocols. They simulated supply requisitions, personnel transfers, training schedules, and tactical coordination, all the mundane communications that a real army would generate. German Y-service listening posts monitored Allied radio frequencies constantly. They tracked call signs, analyzed transmission patterns, and mapped unit locations based on radio signal strength. The fake FUSAG transmissions gave them exactly what they expected to intercept: an enormous American Army group preparing for invasion. The deception required extraordinary attention to detail. Every radio operator had a unique fist, a distinctive pattern in how they tapped out Morse code messages. It was considered impossible to perfectly mimic another operator's fist, but the Ghost Army signals specialists did it anyway, studying and replicating the patterns of real operators from units that had been moved to other locations. German listeners never detected the substitution. Real military units played supporting roles in the deception. The 1st Canadian Army was actually stationed in Kent and Essex in early 1944. Their presence gave substance to the phantom FUSAG. German reconnaissance photographed real Canadian soldiers training in southeast England and concluded they were part of Patton's army group. Later, most Canadian units quietly moved to southern England to actual invasion staging areas near Southampton and Weymouth. But the Germans never noticed their departure because radio traffic from their positions in Kent continued unchanged. What made Operation Fortitude devastatingly effective was something the Germans never suspected. The Allies could read their mail. Bletchley Park, located 50 miles northwest of London, housed the greatest intelligence coup of World War II. British cryptographers had captured German Enigma cipher machines and learned how to decrypt Wehrmacht communications. By 1944, Allied intelligence could intercept and decode German radio messages, often within hours of transmission. This created what intelligence professionals call a closed-loop system. British deception planners would feed false information through double agents like Garbo. They would create physical evidence, like dummy tanks for German reconnaissance to photograph. Then they would intercept German communications to see if the deception had worked. Within days, sometimes hours, Bletchley Park would decrypt German intelligence assessments, discussing FUSAG, Patton's location, and the projected invasion at Calais. The decrypts confirmed the Germans were completely fooled. This feedback loop allowed planners to adjust the deception in real time. If German intelligence showed skepticism about a particular detail, the Allies would reinforce it with additional evidence. If the Germans accepted something completely, they would build upon it with new layers of deception. On June 1, 1944, 5 days before D-Day, Bletchley Park decrypted a transmission from Hiroshi Oshima, the Japanese ambassador to Germany. Oshima had recently met with Hitler. In his report to Tokyo, Oshima recounted Hitler's assessment of the coming invasion. Hitler expected a diversionary attack, possibly in Normandy or Brittany. But the main invasion, he was certain, would come at Pas de Calais, under Patton's command. The Führer believed the Allies had sufficient forces in Britain to launch both operations simultaneously. When Eisenhower read the decrypted report, he knew Operation Fortitude had succeeded completely. Hitler himself believed in Fusag. In May 1944, General Hans Kramer arrived in England under unusual circumstances. Kramer had commanded units in the Afrika Korps under Rommel. Captured in May 1943, he had spent a year in British POW camps. Now, due to poor health, the Allies agreed to exchange him back to Germany through neutral Sweden. Before his departure, British deception planners saw an opportunity too perfect to waste. Allied officers wined and dined Kramer at a farewell dinner. Patton himself attended, introduced as the commander of Fusag. Patton played his role brilliantly, just indiscreet enough to seem like his reputation suggested. He mentioned Pas de Calais multiple times. He hinted at massive forces preparing to strike across the narrowest part of the channel. He let slip sensitive details about timing and scale. Then came the masterstroke. Kramer needed to be driven to his departure point. British officers told him they would drive him through the area where Patton's army was stationed, southeast England, near Dover and Folkestone. The car journey took hours. Through the windows, Kramer saw exactly what the British wanted him to see: military convoys on every road, thousands of troops in camps, vast supply depots, tank formations, artillery positions, a colossal military force preparing for invasion. Road signs and town markers confirmed his location: Kent and Essex, southeast England. Guards at checkpoints wore divisional insignia from Fusag units. Officers he passed wore patches, identifying them as part of Patton's army group. Kramer was shaken by what he witnessed. The Allies possessed far more military strength than German intelligence had estimated. The invasion force appeared enormous, unstoppable, and it was clearly positioned to strike at Calais. What Kramer didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that his entire journey had been theater. The British had driven him through southwest England, not southeast. They had transported him through the real invasion staging areas, near Southampton and Weymouth. The thousands of troops he saw were the actual divisions preparing to invade Normandy, but they had changed all the road signs. They had temporarily swapped unit insignia on uniforms. They had instructed checkpoint guards to claim they were guarding Fusag positions. On May 23rd, Kramer boarded a ship for neutral Sweden. From there, he traveled to Germany. The Abwehr debriefed him extensively. Kramer's report described Patton's enormous army in southeast England, poised to invade Calais. He had seen it with his own eyes. His testimony was unimpeachable. German High Command accepted his report as absolute fact. It confirmed everything. Their reconnaissance, radio intelligence, and double agents had already told them. The invasion would come at Calais. On June 5, 1944, at approximately 9:15 in the evening, the BBC broadcast a message. "It is hot in Suez." Across occupied France, members of the French resistance heard the phrase and knew what it meant. This was one of hundreds of coded messages broadcast nightly to coordinate resistance operations. German intelligence monitored these broadcasts obsessively, trying to decode which messages signaled actual operations. That same evening, another message aired: "Wound my heart with a monotonous languor." This was the second line of Paul Verlaine's poem, Chanson d'automne. German intelligence in France had previously intercepted reports that this specific poem would signal the imminent Allied invasion. At Wehrmacht headquarters in Paris, officers heard the broadcast and raised the alarm. The invasion might begin within 48 hours. They notified Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, supreme commander of German forces in the West. Von Rundstedt ordered some units to elevated alert status. But crucially, 7th Army headquarters in Normandy never received the alert. Why would they need warning? The invasion was coming at Calais, not Normandy. 15th Army at Calais received full notification. 7th Army slept. At 11:30 that night, RAF bombers filled the sky over France. Their targets spread across the coastline from Normandy to Calais and beyond. The raids followed a deliberate pattern. For every target bombed in the Normandy sector, 2 were struck in the Calais region. German defenders at Calais concluded the intense bombing confirmed what they already believed: the invasion would come there. Simultaneously, a more subtle deception unfolded over the English Channel. Operations Glimmer and Taxable sent small boats and aircraft toward Calais and other sectors away from Normandy. The planes dropped aluminum foil called window that created false radar signatures. To German radar operators, it appeared that enormous invasion fleets were approaching multiple locations along the coast. RAF bombers dropped dummy paratroopers east and west of the actual Normandy landing zones. These were crude mannequins, rigged with firecrackers that simulated gunfire when they hit the ground. German units diverted to investigate these airborne landings that didn't exist, pulling defenders away from actual drop zones. At 2 in the morning, June 6th, the first real Allied paratroopers began dropping over Normandy. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions descended through darkness and anti-aircraft fire. Many landed miles from their drop zones. Some drowned in flooded fields Rommel had deliberately created as obstacles. But they began securing bridges, crossroads, and key positions inland from the beaches. At 3 o'clock that morning, Juan Pujol García sent one of the most important messages of his career. Pujol's message to his German handlers arrived too late, deliberately, perfectly too late. He reported that a massive fleet had been spotted leaving southern English ports, heading toward Normandy. This was urgent intelligence. The invasion was beginning. But Pujol's message arrived at 3 a.m., and the German radio operators in Madrid had already gone to sleep. By the time they woke, decoded the message, and forwarded it to Berlin, Allied troops were already fighting on the beaches. The intelligence was accurate, but useless, exactly as Pujol and his British handlers intended. The late arrival of Pujol's warning actually enhanced his credibility. The Germans could see that their best agent had tried to warn them. It wasn't his fault. Their radio operators had been asleep. His intelligence had been correct, but tragically delayed. This made them trust him even more for what came next. At dawn, 156,000 Allied troops began landing on 5 beaches across a 50-mile stretch of Norman coastline: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. The names would become immortal. At Omaha Beach, the American 1st Infantry Division faced the veteran German 352nd Infantry Division. A formation Allied intelligence hadn't known was stationed there. The Americans suffered devastating casualties. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men drowned as the tide came in. Medics worked frantically on beaches, swept by machine gun fire. For several hours, it appeared the landing at Omaha might fail completely. But at other beaches, Allied forces pushed inland despite fierce resistance. Canadian troops took Juno. British forces secured Gold and Sword. American paratroopers held key bridges. The fragile beachhead held barely. In German headquarters, confusion reigned. At 6:30 a.m., Field Marshal Rommel was still in Germany, visiting his wife for her birthday. He had believed the stormy weather made invasion impossible. Hitler was asleep in Bavaria. His subordinates had strict orders never to wake him for any reason. Von Rundstedt saw the reports from Normandy and immediately requested permission to move 2 panzer divisions toward the beaches. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division. Together, they comprised approximately 40,000 men and 500 tanks. If they reached the beaches, while Allied forces were still establishing their foothold, they could potentially drive the invasion back into the sea. But Hitler's chief of staff at OKW refused to authorize the movement without the Führer's permission, and nobody wanted to wake Hitler. By noon, when Hitler finally woke and received briefings, he reviewed the situation and made a catastrophic decision. The Normandy landings were a diversion. Fusag had not yet been committed. The real invasion would come at Calais. Von Rundstedt's panzer divisions would stay in reserve, waiting for Patton's main attack. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, Pujol sent another message to his German handlers. This one would prove even more important than his pre-invasion warning. Pujol reported that he had met with multiple sub-agents in his network. They had consolidated intelligence from various sources. The picture was now clear. The Normandy operation was indeed a diversion. Patton's Fusag remained in southeast England, 75 divisions strong, fully equipped, waiting to strike. The plan was to draw German reserves to Normandy, then launch the real invasion at Calais within weeks. Once German forces were committed in Normandy, Fusag would cross at Calais and face weakened defenses. Pujol's message was detailed, specific, and compelling. He provided unit designations, command structures, and tactical assessments. Most importantly, he urged the Germans not to fall for the Allied trap. They must keep 15th Army at Calais, ready to repel the main invasion. The Germans received this message promptly. They decoded it and forwarded it to the highest levels of German command. Within 2 days, German intelligence sent a response praising Pujol's especially valuable reporting. They noted that all his recent intelligence had been confirmed without exception. More importantly, they acted on it. Hitler ordered 15th Army to remain at Pas de Calais. 19 divisions, approximately 250,000 soldiers would stay in place, defending against an invasion that existed only in Allied imagination. The panzer divisions that von Rundstedt had requested for Normandy remained in reserve, waiting for Fusag to attack. For 7 weeks, Hitler refused to significantly reinforce Normandy. Allied planners had hoped the deception might buy them 14 days. They got 7 weeks long enough to establish an unbreakable beachhead, build artificial harbors to supply their forces, and prepare for the breakout that would liberate France. By late July, when German commanders finally began moving 15th Army units to Normandy, it was far too late. The Allies had landed more than 800,000 troops. They had built the mulberry harbors that allowed them to supply their forces without capturing a French port. They controlled sufficient territory to support sustained operations. On July 20th, a German bomb plot nearly killed Hitler. In the aftermath, he purged officers suspected of disloyalty. The already chaotic German command structure collapsed into paranoid chaos. On July 25th, Operation Cobra began the American breakout from Normandy. Patton's Third Army finally became operational, not as part of Fusag attacking Calais, but as a real force racing across France. The German defense in the west collapsed. Paris would be liberated by late August. The exact moment German intelligence realized they had been deceived remains uncertain. Evidence suggests different officers recognized the truth at different times, but all were powerless to convince Hitler. Some Wehrmacht officers in Normandy began questioning Fusag's existence by mid-July. They noticed that supposed Fusag divisions they had heard about kept appearing in Normandy instead of Calais. They intercepted radio traffic that contradicted the story of a massive army group in southeast England. Local commanders sent reports noting the inconsistencies. But Hitler's belief in Fusag persisted into August. On August 1st, German intelligence reports still listed 75 Allied divisions in Britain, actual number 37, and most of those were already in France. The fictional divisions created by Fortitude and Garbo's reporting had been accepted as fact. By mid-August, reality became impossible to deny. Patton's Third Army wasn't at Calais, it was racing across France. The massive Fusag invasion that was supposed to follow Normandy had never materialized. The tanks photographed in Kent and Essex had somehow vanished without crossing the Channel. German officers began investigating what had gone wrong with their intelligence. They reviewed reconnaissance photographs more carefully and realized many of the tanks in earlier images had suspicious characteristics. They didn't create proper ground depressions. They didn't weather correctly over time. Some appeared to have moved between photos in ways real tanks couldn't. Radio intelligence analysts noticed that the complex network of Fusag communications had suddenly gone silent. Units that had been broadcasting constantly for months had simply stopped transmitting. There had been no explanation, no communications about movement or deployment, just sudden silence. The Abwehr began questioning reports from their agents in Britain. They sent queries to Juan Pujol, asking for clarification about Fusag's location and status. Pujol, with Harris's help, crafted responses explaining that security had tightened, information was harder to obtain. Many units had moved under radio silence. But some German intelligence officers were beginning to suspect a darker truth. What if Arabelle wasn't real? What if the entire network of agents was fictional? What if every piece of intelligence they had trusted for years was deliberate disinformation? These suspicions remained largely internal. Officers who voiced them too loudly risked accusations of defeatism or conspiracy, especially in the paranoid atmosphere following the July 20th bomb plot. Some kept their doubts in private memos. Others shared concerns quietly with trusted colleagues. On September 28, 1944, the Allies officially ended Operation Fortitude. They no longer needed to maintain the deception. Paris had been liberated. Allied armies were approaching Germany's borders. The war in the West was clearly lost for Germany. But the full extent of the deception wouldn't become clear until after the war, when Allied investigators captured German intelligence archives and interviewed surviving Abwehr officers. Understanding how German intelligence fell so completely for Operation Fortitude requires understanding how intelligence analysis actually works and how it can fail. Catastrophically. Intelligence officers face an impossible challenge. They must construct accurate pictures of reality from incomplete, contradictory, and often deliberately misleading information. They receive hundreds of data points daily: reconnaissance photos, radio intercepts, agent reports, prisoner interrogations, signals intelligence, captured documents. From this flood of information, they must identify patterns, assess reliability, and make predictions that commanders will stake thousands of lives upon. The human mind handles this challenge by creating frameworks, mental models of how the world works. These frameworks determine which information seems credible and which seems suspicious. They guide interpretation of ambiguous evidence. They connect separate data points into coherent narratives. The crucial vulnerability is this. Once a framework is established, the mind actively resists changing it. Information that confirms the existing framework is accepted easily. Information that contradicts it is scrutinized skeptically, explained away, or ignored. German intelligence began the war with several framework assumptions about Allied strategy. First, the Allies would attack across the English Channel. At its narrowest point, simple geography and logistics made this obvious. Second, the Allies would assign their best generals to lead their most important operations. This followed standard military logic. The Allies possessed sufficient forces to threaten multiple invasion points. Simultaneously, German analysts overestimated Allied strength based on industrial prize. Capacity. Operation Fortitude didn't try to change these assumptions. Instead, it reinforced them perfectly. Every piece of false intelligence the Allies fed to Germany fit comfortably within the existing German framework. Patton in southeast England? If this story of intelligence, deception, and the invisible war behind World War II fascinated you, subscribe to this channel for more untold military history. We dive deep into the operations that changed warfare, the individuals who altered history, and the moments when strategy mattered more than strength. Leave a comment below. What aspect of Operation Fortitude surprised you most? What other military deceptions should we cover? Your engagement helps us grow and create more content, exploring the invisible side of warfare. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we upload new stories about the intelligence operations, secret missions, and strategic deceptions that shaped the modern world. Share this video with anyone interested in World War II history, military strategy, or intelligence operations. The story of how rubber tanks and fake radio signals saved thousands of lives deserves to be known. Members get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes research notes, and extended interviews with military historians. The next time you see historical photographs of military buildups, remember, sometimes the most powerful armies are the ones that never existed at all. Until next time, question what you see, verify what you believe, and never forget that in warfare, truth is always attended by a bodyguard of lies.